ينضم إلينا من روما البروفيسور جفري ساكس، المفكر الاقتصادي الأميركي ورئيس شبكة حلول التنمية المستدامة التابعة للأمم المتحدة. أهلا بك معنا بروفيسور جفري. هناك في الغرب وفي الإعلام الغربي من يوجه النقد لنتنياهو، لشخص نتنياهو، وليس كأن المشكلة هي في وجود احتلال إسرائيلي للفلسطينيين ولأراضيهم. لكنك أنت في محاضراتك وندواتك تتحدث بإنصاف وبعدل، ليس ضد نتنياهو فقط بل عن الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للفلسطينيين. ما الذي تريد أن تشرحه لجمهورك في الغرب؟
Well, this radical Israeli regime has made war all over the Middle East and also North Africa and the Horn of Africa. This has been going on for almost 30 years now. Netanyahu has been prime minister for 17 of those years. He is a war criminal and a disaster, in my view, but what he represents is an extremist government that is dedicated to one proposition, and that is to rule out a state of Palestine as part of the two-state solution called for by the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, except for the US veto. In other words, the whole world wants a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel in order to achieve peace. Netanyahu is dedicated entirely to preventing that from happening, and the United States has been complicit in that during this entire period of Netanyahu's rule from 1996 onward. Now we have a war not only in Gaza and the West Bank, because we shouldn't forget the extraordinary violence taking place in the West Bank, also in Lebanon and Syria, and Netanyahu openly is trying to provoke a war with Iran. So the situation is extremely dangerous. The number one question is whether Donald Trump will do what all previous US presidents have done, and that is to fall in line with the Israel lobby. If Donald Trump analyzes the situation from America's point of view, he would absolutely lead the effort for a state of Palestine. It would only take the US vote to make that happen, because the US was the only veto of that happening when it came to a vote in the UN Security Council. Trump would say to Netanyahu, I'm president of the United States, not you. We are going to run policy for the American people, not for a radical Israeli regime committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that's what Trump would do. But no president has done that in the past 30 years. And whether Trump does it or not is still to be determined. But based on past experience, it's an uphill struggle.
طيب، إسرائيل يعني احتلت أراضي في جنوب لبنان الآن، تتوسع ويتوسع احتلالها في سوريا، تريد أن تضم الضفة الغربية، تهجر الفلسطينيين من قطاع غزة. هل تعمل إسرائيل الآن على تحقيق شعارها اللي هو واضح في العلم الإسرائيلي، الخطين الأزرقين من الفرات إلى النيل، وبمساعدة الولايات المتحدة؟
This is a regime in Israel that wants effective control over the Middle East, and it thinks that the U.S. military power will deliver that. In fact, the U.S. military power cannot deliver that. All that is the result of Netanyahu's idea is endless war. There has been war raging in the Middle East perpetually because Netanyahu refuses peace. He's actually quite explicit about it. Hamas has said, end the war, we return the hostages and the war is over. Netanyahu says, no, we must continue the war. It's a trick. Do not accept peace. He is a man of war, not a man of peace. That is his entire politics. To have peace means to have Palestinians with their own state. This is what Netanyahu fundamentally opposes, and he is ready to keep Israel in endless war and to try to drag the United States into endless war to achieve this radical, unjust, and illegal vision.
بس حضرتك بروفيسور، كيف تنظر إلى مستقبل القضية الفلسطينية؟ يعني هل حل الدولتين أعدم؟ ونتنياهو أصلا يجاهر بذلك، يقول ما في شيء اسمه دولة فلسطينية، والغرب ومجلس الأمن والأمم المتحدة لا يتحركون باتجاه تحقيق الدولة الفلسطينية.
It's not quite like that. First of all, don't believe anything Netanyahu says. He's a criminal and a liar. The truth is that the vast majority of the world supports Palestine to have its own state as member of the United Nations. When the vote came in the UN Security Council, there was only one vote against. That was the United States. There were 12 votes for, one veto, and 2 abstentions. When the issue of the Palestinian right to political self-determination comes to the UN General Assembly, it's more than 180 votes out of 193 votes. The two-state solution is not dead. It is close to happening. It is one vote and only one vote away, and that is the United States government, not Israel. Israel has no veto on a state of Palestine. Nobody should think about a peace process or negotiating with Israel. That's ridiculous. Israel doesn't negotiate. It has no intention of negotiating. But the state of Palestine as UN member state doesn't depend on Israel. It depends on the United Nations. It depends on the US changing its one vote. The Arab countries, the Arab League, needs to say to the United States, you are the barrier to peace now, because you, the United States, have the single vote that can bring peace to the region by establishing the state of Palestine. We're not dealing with Israel. We're not negotiating with Israel. Israel's violating the law every day. The International Court of Justice in 2024 made clear that Israel's occupation of Palestine is illegal. So the Arab League, the 57 countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the G20 countries, the European Union, the BRICS countries, everybody has to tell Donald Trump now, clearly, unambiguously, there will be no peace and there can be no decent relations with the United States unless the United States stops blocking peace. You know, Saudi Arabia has talked about investing hundreds of billions of dollars in the United States. But Saudi Arabia is also very clear there can be no peace unless there's a state of Palestine. And Donald Trump needs to hear this. He may not understand this, but the next few weeks are decisive. Don't listen to Israel. Israel has no say in this. This is about US politics. And what's interesting is Netanyahu was trying to talk Trump into war with Iran. I think he failed. The United States and Iran are having fruitful negotiations now. They just had another successful round of negotiations in Rome in the last couple of days. Donald Trump is not doing what Netanyahu says. So he needs to understand also, Donald Trump needs to understand that he can make peace. He can have good relations with the 1.8 billion or 2 billion people living in the Islamic world, with the 57 countries of the Islamic world. He can save America from another tragic, terrible war by simply supporting the state of Palestine in the UN Security Council. There will be a high-level session at the United Nations in June 17 to 20, on implementing the two-state solution. The whole world needs to say to Donald Trump, You can be a hero, but you, not Israel, you are the single blockade to peace right now.
يعني بروفيسور، أنت بكلامك تبث لنا بعض الأمل وتحيي الأمل يعني في أنفس الناس في الشرق الأوسط بأنه دولة فلسطينية قد تتحقق يوما ما. لك عبارة جميلة قلت في إحدى محاضراتك بأنه فعلا السلام لن يتحقق إلا إذا الولايات المتحدة أقلعت، توقفت عن الفيتو في وجه أن تكون فلسطين الدولة 194 العضو 194 في الأمم المتحدة. طب الولايات المتحدة ما الذي يمنعها من العمل من أجل تحقيق هذا الحل؟
Well, the Israel lobby in the United States has been so powerful for decades. So much campaign financing, so much siding with what we call the neoconservatives in the United States, many of whom are ardent Zionists in the extremist sense. And so Israel has had its way with US foreign policy for 30 years. But what is the result? The US created disasters in Sudan, in Libya, in Somalia, in Syria, in Palestine, in Iraq, by listening to Netanyahu. The man's a disaster. That's why he has an arrest warrant right now against him. His whole country is in uproar right now because he's trying to take over every institution in the country just now. So Israel itself is in an uproar. Donald Trump needs to understand that's not America's interest. America's interest is peace. America's interest is good relations with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, with Jordan, with all of the countries of the region. And this could happen, absolutely. It's one vote that needs to change. So it's not the standard of American politics, but frankly, we've had 30 years of Netanyahu's politics steering the US foreign policy. It's been a disaster. So the question is whether the United States can wake up, open its eyes, and understand what America's true interests are.
بروفيسور، تعرف أنت في العالم العربي يعني الكثير يتداول فيديوهات مقاطع لمحاضراتك وندواتك، وأنا شخصيا يعني جدا أحرص على متابعة كل ما تقول. ربما اللافت أن يكون هذا الصوت يهودي أمريكي يهاجم إسرائيل كاحتلال أقصد، وهي التي يعني تتشبث بمنطق يهودي وتبرر ما تفعله بالفلسطينيين من منطلق يهودي. الآن اليهود في أمريكا وغير أمريكا يقولون ما تفعله إسرائيل يسيء أصلا لنا كيهود، يسيء للديانة اليهودية وتعاليم الديانة اليهودية.
What Israel is doing is extremist Zionist ideology. That is not Jewish values. That's not the Jewish faith. That's not Jewish ethics. It's also criminal. It's against international law. So this is a completely different matter. What an extremist state does is one thing. What ethics are is quite another thing. I believe in the ethics of peace, the ethics of cooperation, the ethics of human decency, the ethics of the rule of law. This is not what an extremist government in Israel is representing at all right now. And you know, within the Jewish community, there are so many different views. To equate this radical extremist government in Israel with the Jewish community is a huge mistake, because Jews are so divided in different opinions. Rabbis are divided. And for me, this has nothing to do with the question of Jewish faith or Judaism. This has to do with the question of human decency and the international rule of law.
لفتني يعني شيء لك قول، ومن خلال يعني حديثك تذكرت هذا الشيء لما قلت انه كوفي عنان كان قد وصل إلى تقريبا سلام في سوريا، يعني عندما كان قبل تقريبا يعني عقد ونصف أو أكثر. ولكن قلت الطرف الذي عارض هذا السلام في سوريا بين سوريا وإسرائيل الولايات المتحدة، كيف؟
Two issues when it comes to Syria. First, just as a background, we have to understand that the Syrian war was caused by the United States. There was an order given by President Obama to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Now, I'm not talking about whether Assad was good, bad, whether there were protests. Yes, there were protests against him and so forth, but not a war. The war came because President Obama instructed the CIA with $1 billion assigned, as far as we know at the start, and we don't even have a proper accounting, but with lots of funding, lots of armaments to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. This is what we call a regime change operation. It's a disgusting part of American foreign policy. And it was largely done, as all these wars in the Middle East, in conjunction with Israel, because the idea was Assad was getting too close to Iran, so he must be overthrown. Netanyahu's idea is if a government opposes Israel's occupation of Palestine, well, you overthrow that government. That's the Netanyahu doctrine. Overthrow governments that object to Israel's control over the Palestinian people. So in 2011, Obama decided that the US government would overthrow Assad, and he tasked the CIA with this operation in something called Operation Timber Sycamore. Violence started, of course, a war broke out, and the UN asked the former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, to help broker a peace before the killings became massive. And so Kofi Annan, one of the greatest statesmen of our time, went, he met with all of the parties, he reached an agreement, but the United States alone blocked the peace because the US told Kofi Annan, we will not accept any agreement unless Bashar al-Assad leaves the first minute of that agreement. In other words, the US stuck to its regime change idea. And that's a lot of nerve, by the way, of the United States saying who governs other countries. But of course, that's part of American arrogance stretching back many decades. Kofi Annan stepped down as a mediator, as a special representative of the Secretary General, because the United States blocked the peace. What happened then? What happened was another 13 years of war. Hundreds of thousands of people dead because the United States blocked the peace. And this is happening all over the Middle East. There's war in Lebanon, war in Syria. There was war in Iraq. There are 2 wars in Sudan because the United States took the lead to break Sudan apart so that Sudan and South Sudan became 2 separate countries, and now there's civil wars in both of those countries. And there's civil war in Libya, another US regime change operation to overthrow Gaddafi. And my point is, this is part of Netanyahu's doctrine. Overthrow all of these governments because these governments resist Israel's occupation of Palestine. Well, there's a much simpler way to have peace without hundreds of thousands or millions of people being killed, without trillions of dollars being spent. And that is to change one vote, the US vote in the UN Security Council, so that Palestine exists as a UN member state.
يعني ما حدث في العالم العربي قبل 15 سنة وما يسمى بالربيع العربي ليس ثورات حقيقية؟ كان مخطط له من إسرائيل وأمريكا لتفتيت العالم العربي وربما تفتيت المفتت وإعادة رسم خارطة الدول العربية؟
You know, it's hard to say. I happen to know a lot about the Syrian situation because part of it was leaked, this Operation Timber Sycamore. It was covered actually by the New York Times, no less, in around 2016. Not very much covered. Most people don't know about it, but it's there to discover. I happen to know about it because of the UN. I can't say about other circumstances, but what we do know is that Israel has tried to draw the US into war after war after war. And we know, certainly because Donald Trump himself said so, that Israel was trying to lure the United States these days into a war with Iran. Shame. Can you imagine to spread a war that could become a world war in this way? This is the recklessness, the illegality of this radical regime in Israel. It has to stop. And it would stop the day the United States starts asserting its own foreign policy, not Israel's foreign policy.
بخصوص الرئيس ترامب، في ناس اللي بيقولوا انه الرئيس ترامب رجل اقتصاد وعبقري اقتصاد، وانه رجل الحلول السياسية من خلال الصفقات الاقتصادية. لك ندوة وأنت تتمتع يعني حس السخرية الهادفة، قلت بأنه في مادة، يعني مادة النقد الدولي، تدرس هذا الموضوع في اليوم الثاني من المخصص، ولو كان ترامب طالبا عندك لجعلته راسبا. طب على أي أساس ينظر الناس إلى ترامب أنه رجل عبقري في الاقتصاد إذن؟
Look, Trump misunderstands international economics. He thinks that if the U.S. is running a trade deficit, it's because other countries are cheating the U.S. This is trivially mistaken. And Trump's misunderstanding led to his declaring an emergency because of the trade deficit and then using so-called emergency powers to set tax rates, the so-called tariffs. Now, all of this, in my view, is illegal. I don't think courts will accept any of this, but it's also economically illiterate. It is just not the way economics works, and it's not the meaning of a trade deficit, which is a measure of how much a country spends above its earnings. It's completely different from what Trump thinks. If you go to the store with a credit card and you buy a lot of goods more than you earn, you're running a trade deficit with the store. That's what a trade deficit means. You don't blame the shop for that. You blame your spending as being beyond your means. And the United States should look inward, understand that it has a huge government deficit. So the government is acting like our country's credit card. It's borrowing, quote, on behalf of the public and then spending on behalf of the public and leading to a huge trade deficit with the rest of the world. It's not something to blame the rest of the world. It's something to fix right at home. But Trump doesn't understand that. The financial markets reacted very badly to what Trump is doing. And when one of his protectionist advisors was away, other advisors talked the president out of these tariffs, which made no sense. So we still don't know really what's going to happen with all of this, but it's not based on sound reasoning.
بروفيسور، أنت تأتي من أعراق الجامعات وتدرس في أعراق الجامعات، يعني درست في هارفارد وتدرس في كولومبيا. كيف ترى موضوع حرب ترامب ومن معه على التعليم العالي، قطع التمويل عن جامعة هارفارد، تهديد جامعة كولومبيا، كل هذا بسبب الاحتجاجات المناصرة للإنسانية لعدالة القضية الفلسطينية وغير ذلك؟
There are many motivations, I think, of this war on the universities. I compare it a little bit to China's culture war of the 1960s, when Mao led radicals to close down China's major universities. It set China back about 15 years. It was a tragedy and a disaster. And Trump is attacking American universities in the same way. Part of it is a populist attack on what they consider elite institutions. Part of it is supposedly about anti-Semitism, but as I explained earlier, criticizing Israel has absolutely zero to do with anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And so all that's happening, again, is very cruel, nasty, self-destructive, makes no sense, and we don't know where it will go. Harvard is going to court to defend itself. Good, because what Trump is doing is, in my opinion, plainly illegal. Whether the judges exercise their independence or not, that remains to be seen.
أخيراً، بعيداً عن السياسة، بعيداً عن الاقتصاد، دائماً أرى من خلفك آلة العود الشرقية، وأنت محب للفنون وعضو على ما أعتقد يعني في جمعية فنون. ماذا تعني لك هذه الآلة حتى تحتفظ بها؟
Well, I'm actually in Rome, a place that I love because it's a center of world culture. And the place where we're staying is filled with art objects. And so this is part of Rome's deep culture. You know, Rome is understandably called the Eternal City because it is the essence of thousands of years of Western culture, art, and history. And so for me, that's very important. Civilization means that we have our culture, we have our ethics, we have our proper behavior. And maybe the United States is just too young. It's, after all, only 250 years old. It's a baby of nations. Think about the Middle East is 5,000 years old at a minimum of the states of the Middle East, and probably about 9,000 years old in terms of civilization. And so maybe the United States is just too young to understand these things. But when you're in Rome, you appreciate deep culture. And it is culture that can save the world, not the clash of civilizations, but actually the alliance of civilizations, because great civilizations respect each other, treat each other with the awe, with the admiration, and with the dignity. And if we have that approach, we're going to have a peaceful world.
أنا أنقل لك شكر عشرات آلاف العرب في الشرق الأوسط الذين يشكرونك على يعني صوتك، هذا الصوت اليهودي، الصوت المفكر الاقتصادي السياسي المناصر حقيقة للحق وللعدالة وتحديدا الحق الفلسطيني. إذن من روما بروفيسور جفري ساكس المفكر الاقتصادي الأميركي، شكرا جزيلا لك. شكرا.